there's just such an enormous span of issues related to migration, almost everything, particularly these days. You will look at the news every day today, and you will see something that is related to migration or asylum issues. It is enormous, and I would love to talk to you about every issue, and I've tried to tell you everything in this talk, but it is limited in terms of what we can cover. So there may be things that I'm just going to miss, maybe important things or not so important things, but I want to present to you some of the issues that I'm grappling with, and I'm going to give you some details of some of the empirical research that I have conducted myself. So, migration touches on issues to do with ethnicity, ethnic conflict, conflicts with minorities, discrimination, racism, xenophobia, which we will talk about later. The demography issues with regard to population and how migrants affect the balance of forces which are political and religious and ethnic and racial and so on and so forth. It's huge. They impact, there's studies on how migration affects the environment, right, and housing and gender, culture and so on and so forth. What I'm going to do today, now I have to just figure out how to do it. Oh, good. My dear colleague Mohamed last night showed me how to do a PowerPoint where you just do things like that. It's so nice. I've never done it before, and I'm really chuffed. Okay, so there is a general theme, a critical theme to what I'm going to present, and throughout all my work over the last 5 years with CILE, and it's this, that there is a failure of the state, of the nation state in the Middle East. I'm specifically focusing on the Gulf states, Lebanon and Jordan. There's a failure of the state and state legislation to stop and prevent exploitation, fraud and abuse of the migrant labour forces in those countries. Qatar is involved deeply in reform, legislative reform, with regard to the migrant workforce as it's commissioned to do the World Cup, in the Soccer World Cup in 2022, and I've been involved in discussions and consultation in those reforms. But I still believe in this issue, that the state is not actually capable of bringing about the serious reform that is required. That a focus on Islamic ethics of protection of migrants and foreigners is required in a way to overcome the divide between the principles, legal and moral principles, and actual practices. And this, I think, and as I've argued before, is the perennial dilemma in ethics, is this mismatch between the principles and the practice. As Khalid Abul Fadl has talked about, the Islamic moral impulses. I really like this idea. From Abbas Barzagar, The Living Fiqh or Practical Theology of Muslim Humanitarianism. This is relating more specifically to refugees. I will be mixing migrants and refugees, go from one to the other from time to time. And you will understand why, because there's some conceptualization issues there. Or the issue of neighborliness, which Tahir Zaman has talked extensively about, has written a book. And these are ideas about Islamic ethics and principles and culture that go beyond the law, that go beyond national legislation in relation to how one treats foreigners, how one deals with foreigners, whoever they may be and whatever their circumstances might be. I'm just very briefly going to go through some definitions for you, just so that we have some understanding, common understanding about what some of the terms mean in this field of inquiry. So firstly, migration itself is a generic term for the movement of people both within and across national boundaries, whether voluntary or forced. The idea of forced migration will come across. Now, we also, what is not here, I think, is also the idea of internal migration. There is an internal migration, but most literature deals with international, that is, people who cross boundaries, cross borders. Immigration, and you will see that these terms are used in different ways in the media. Journalists and others use them in different ways. I use these terms in very specific ways so that there's a common understanding. Immigration is the idea of moving to another country on a permanent basis for settlement. Immigration is where a person wants to leave a country. That's leaving a country, leaving your country to go somewhere else. To settle, going somewhere else to settle, not on a temporary basis. Although it can be used for people who immigrate on a temporary basis. Labour migration is where people who move across borders in order to get employment, specifically for labour. And that tends to be temporary contract labour or migrant labour. And this is, migrant workers are the kind of population that I deal mostly with, and I deal mostly also with low-skilled, low-income workers for my research. This is the definition from the what's called the Migrant Worker Convention, United Nations Migrant Worker Convention. We'll come across it in a minute. Oh, there it is there. Now, economic migration is also an important concept, as it has, particularly in the last few years, since the Syrian crisis, it's come to mean something very specific and controversial, and I will be talking about that controversy in a moment. Okay, so it's a person who wants to improve their circumstances, or families who want to improve their circumstances by migrating to another country. Forced migration. Now, here is a term that was actually coined by a colleague of mine many years ago, somebody I worked with, who unfortunately died very recently. The idea that people are forced to migrate as distinct from voluntary migration. Now, here's where it's included not just the definition of a refugee, but for natural disasters that might occur, all kinds of reasons where the idea of forced migration can be applied. But some people have gone too far. For example, some might argue, look, my circumstances are so bad, economic circumstances are so bad, I'm forced to go somewhere else. This is where there's a kind of a line that is blurred, and we're not really sure what category to put them in. They will tend to go into economic migrants. I'm happy for you to ask any questions. Now, asylum seekers, you know what an asylum seeker is, a person who is seeking safety from persecution, which is defined under the Refugee Convention, which we'll come to in a moment. And there's a distinction. It's the person who is asking for protection, asking for asylum, an asylum seeker. That doesn't mean that they are a refugee. They remain as an asylum seeker until they are granted refugee status, usually by the UNHCR, which is the UN body that administers the Convention on Refugees. Okay? So if they are not accepted as a refugee, then they can be deported. But not until then, and which we'll come to also. So a refugee, this is the UN definition, is a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinions, is outside the country of his nationality or her nationality, and is unable, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to avail himself or herself of the protection of that country. This is the definition. It was developed in 1951 with the convention and has remained precisely that ever since. Okay. Now, asylum is simply the protection of a state of people on its territory. Now, the principle, based on the principle of non-refoulement. Now, non-refoulement is an extremely important concept. Does anybody know what it means? Not to return. Yeah. So you do not. So an asylum seeker comes into the country, maybe illegally, right, or unauthorized entry. Now, until it is determined whether the asylum seeker is a refugee or not, the state cannot send that person back from where they came if they have a fear of being persecuted. Their lives may be in danger. But until that has been determined, they cannot send them back. Now, maybe they find that if they sent them back, nothing's going to happen to them, and that they're not really a refugee, and that can happen. So, but the idea of non-refoulement is an extremely important one to safeguard and protect people who are seeking asylum. Now we have what's developing now is the idea of environmentally displaced persons. It is not decided yet whether they may be classified as refugees. There's a lot of arguments for and against it, against them being classified as refugees. Why? Because, as we'll see in a moment, refugees attract special consideration and resources and protection. So the jury is out yet on these kinds of circumstances where people are forced to flee for environmental reasons, like which are the consequences of climate change and so on. But at the moment, there's no legal definition. Now, I'm not going to give you everything here, but some of the Islamic terms that are used and invoked. The research in Islamic scholarship in this field is still very rudimentary. There's much more in relation to business, Islamic business ethics, and that there are some connections, but not all. So this idea that since Adam migrated from heaven to earth, the tradition of Islam considers all human beings as immigrants. Therefore, the primordial fatherland of humanity is heaven, while the earth is a place for temporary relocation. This view seems to be the dominant one in the sayings of the Prophet as well, who likens himself to a traveller who stays for a short time to rest under the shade of a tree and then continues on his journey. I don't know if you see your lives as resting in the shade of a tree, but how many of you here consider themselves migrants or connected to a migrant or offspring of migrants? all of you. They must. I mean, we are all affected by this.
Even if we don't consider ourselves migrants, in Belgium they will remind you that's
true.
Exactly.
Yes. Yes.
So I think Mexicans have this. We have this strong feeling that the U.S. is, or at least this area of the U.S. was originally Mexico.
Oh yeah.
And so a lot of us, feel like we're not.
You're home.
Like this is our space, even though it's the U.S. So
yes.
When people ask me like, do you feel like, you're an immigrant here, or your father's an immigrant? I'm like, no, I feel like we're returning home. Like this is our land. So we have that little notion.
That's very provocative for some people, wouldn't it be?
Yeah,
it's like me going to Israel. Yeah. Okay. So you all understand what hijra is. I mean, the idea of migration is so fundamental in the consciousness of Islam and Muslims, because the calendar begins with the migration, and I'm still, and I'm very, very happy to have a discussion about this. That is, was the hijra, I mean, it's often translated as the migration in English, but was it asylum seeking? Were they refugees or were they migrants, as we distinguish between the two, right? Now, we'll come to see that in Islam, it actually doesn't matter, right? This is that the idea that it doesn't matter what the motivations for the migration are or were, to my mind, is one of the most wonderful things that Islam brings to this. But in the context of today, it creates an enormous dilemma because it can't be implemented. It's idealistic. Anyway, we'll come to that. So other terms, gharib, muhajir, muhajroon, the Ansar, and the whole debate about Dar al-Islam or Dar al-Harb, which you all know about, right? The land of Islam versus the land of war, and then if you are in a land where you are persecuted, you should go to Dar al-Islam where you can maintain your religion. This dichotomy basically is not used much anymore. It's invoked as an historical phenomenon, but that it doesn't really apply anymore. Manja, like the refuge, right? The idea that if they couldn't find a place to flee, to go to caves or somewhere where they could be protected. Mustamin, people who have been granted protection by an Islamic State. Istajara, seeking refugees. And there are so many, some of the scholarship on this just shows lots and lots of different connotations and concepts in the texts relating to various aspects and synonyms and so on in relation to asylum seeking and refugees. Okay. I don't need to go into all of those and so on. So, what's interesting here on what I call the compulsion of migration. So from the Quran, indeed, those whom the angels take while wronging themselves, the angels will say, in what condition were you? They will say, we were oppressed in the land. The angels will say, was not the earth of Allah spacious enough for you to emigrate therein? For those their refuge is hell, and evil it is as a destination. So here's this, it's like a sarcastic kind of idea, right? To say, if you were oppressed, why didn't you move? Go to a place of safety. So this is like a compulsion to make sure that you don't suffer the indignities of oppression. And on the compulsion of asylum, this is the most quoted verse from the Quran. And if any one of the polytheists seeks your protection, then grant him protection so that he may hear the words of Allah. Then deliver him to his place of safety. That is because they are a people who do not know. Now, the sentence, then deliver him to his place of safety, is a crucial sentence. And that conforms with the principle of non-refoulement, right? You only send the person to a place of safety, not back to where they are oppressed or in danger, right? So, without regard to race or religion, they should be protected. In other words, a person comes to you, asks for refuge, asks for protection, you are obliged to give it to them. Talk about the religion, and then send him on his way, but to a place of safety. So motivation is not a consideration here. Whereas I've just showed you the various distinctions between types of migration: labour migration, economic migration, environmental migration, etc. Family, education, all sorts of different motivations to migrate. And the principle of non-refoulement is assumed. And here we have, and as it's been said over and over again, that the principles of refugee rights and those that are enshrined in the UN Refugee Convention were all prefigured in the Quran. I'm not going to spend any time on this, but just to say that there's the International Bill of Rights, these so-called 3 particular conventions, and the core international human rights instruments. Here, just note number 7, which is the Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families. So, in my work, this has become a very important convention. This is the convention. It took a long time to be ratified. It only required 20 countries to sign for this convention to come into force. It took something like, 13 years for 20 countries. It was not a popular convention. Now there are a lot more. But what was important, it was a very comprehensive convention covering all these issues about migrant workers and their families, but also including the rights of labour, of migrant workers who are in an irregular situation. In other words, who are working illegally in a country, that they have rights to. Right? This, of course, was not very attractive to many governments. So, as of October 2018, 54 states have ratified this convention, but they're mainly countries that send workers. In other words, people leaving those countries to go and work in other countries. Okay, it's like Egypt. Egypt signs everything. Egypt signs every convention before it's even passed in the General Assembly. They love the conventions, but do they implement them? No. But they certainly signed this convention, and it was very interesting when I was living in Egypt, tracing the correspondence between the United Nations Committee handling this convention and the government of Mubarak at that time. Right. So countries that receive a lot of migrants and migrant labour have not signed because they don't want to be burdened by providing the rights to migrant workers in their countries, as it's given in the... no migrant receiving state in Western Europe or North America has ratified the convention, nor Australia, the Arab states of the Gulf, India, South Africa. They haven't signed it either. Now, this is the Refugee Convention. 1951, it was passed obviously just after the Second World War and was designed to cater for mainly the persecuted populations in Europe at the time, mainly the Jewish population fleeing the Nazis, and to provide comprehensive principles for the rights of asylum seekers and refugees. The reference to the 1967 protocol was simply that in 1967 they decided that the convention was too narrow. It specified Europeans, people fleeing Europe, right? That was the context at that time. So it was broadened to anybody in 1967. That's all the protocol did, was to broaden the scope of it. Okay. And the core principle of non-reform. In 1969, the Organisation of African Unity Convention passed a slightly different refugee convention for Africa. And what was really interesting about that convention was that it broadened the scope. Instead of what the UN convention did, was to say that, every individual that applies for refugee status has to go through an interview to determine whether they are a refugee or not. In other words, they have to show evidence that they're being persecuted under the terms of the Refugee Convention. But this convention said, owing to external aggression, occupation, foreign domination, or events seriously disturbing the public order in either part or whole of his country or origin or nationality. In other words, if you come from a country with those conditions, you should automatically be granted refugee status, right? And that in essence, the UNHCR has come to adopt that in certain cases with what they now call prima facie refugee status. So Syrians, for example, were granted prima facie refugee status. So if you were a Syrian in a country other than Syria, you were considered to be a refugee. You did not have to go through an individual status determination interview. Right? And that's what the Africans did, which I thought was very insightful. And similar, the 10 South American countries passed their own convention in relation to refugees as well. The Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights in 1981 and the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, the Organisation of Islamic Conference, 57 states of that conference. Every man shall have every person shall have the right within the framework of the Sharia to free movement and to select his place of residence, whether within or outside his country, and if persecuted, is entitled to seek asylum in another country. The country of refuge shall be obliged to provide protection to the asylum seeker until his safety has been attained. That's pretty clear, right? Question is whether that is adopted in practice. And I think we'll see that it's not entirely. Then there's the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam. Again, what we see with these conventions from Islam is reactivity, reactions to what has already taken place in the West, and in particular in the United Nations conventions, with slight modifications. The Arab League's Convention on Refugees was never ratified or implemented, and the Ashgabat Declaration of International on Refugees in the Muslim World. These were all statements that pretty much mirrored the UN Refugee Convention of 1951. Eleven Muslim majority countries have ratified the 51 Convention. These are the states that have ratified that convention. None of the GCC states have. And what we find today is that the so-called global refugee crisis is overwhelmingly a Muslim phenomenon. That they come from Muslim countries and they're housed or they are protected by Muslim countries in various conditions. Okay, so as of 2015, over 65% of the world's 21.3 million refugees come from Muslim countries. That's including the 5.2 million Palestinian refugees. Almost 40% of the forcibly displaced, now that includes internally displaced as well as externally displaced, are hosted in the Middle East and North African region. So this is telling us something about what is happening. And over half of the refugees are children under the age of 18. Around 54% of the 8.7 million non-Palestinian officially registered refugees are from 3 Muslim countries, from Syria, Afghanistan and Somalia. And as of June 2016, most of the Syrian refugees were being hosted by neighbouring countries: Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. And these are large numbers for some of these countries to cope with. And lots of stories around this. Around 900,000 Syrians have filed asylum claims in Europe, while the resettlement countries, I have to explain what resettlement is to you, have taken relatively few. USA, 18,000. Canada, 40,000. Australia, 12,000. These are very low numbers. In the UNHCR, the dealing with refugees, there are 3, what they call 3 durable solutions. 3 durable solutions for refugees. It's repatriation. That is voluntary repatriation. That is back to their home countries, but it must be voluntary. Sometimes countries pay people to go back, and they make their own calculations as to whether the risk is worth it. Repatriation, integration, that is integration into the country of asylum, where they've been granted refugee status. And thirdly, resettlement. that is resettlement, to a third country. So traditionally, countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, were the principal resettlement countries that would take refugees after they had been granted refugee status in another country. Okay. Now, when the Syrian crisis, the Gulf states are wealthy states, the oil and gas wealth in those countries. They did not sign the 1951 Refugee Convention. It is largely understood that they didn't sign it because they were opposed to giving citizenship rights, which the convention demanded of people who are resettled, that they get citizenship. They go to another country, they're allowed to work, they're allowed to get educated and be treated as citizens, and then after a period of time to actually be given citizenship in their resettlement country. The Gulf states, of course, as you know, are very tight about granting citizenship because of the wealth they want to keep for the existing citizenry. So in this sense, I'll come back to the Gulf in a minute in relation to the Syrian refugees, because it's an important controversy. One of the important principles in the Convention, Article 31, says for states not to penalise people who enter their country, that is, asylum seekers who enter their country illegally, unauthorised entry, like people getting on a boat from Tunisia and going over to Italy and arriving on the shores. Okay? So that's entering the country illegally. They haven't arranged a visa, etc. Now, the Convention says do not penalise them for that. Why? Because people who are fleeing persecution are desperate. And you should acknowledge that if they are desperate and they're running for their lives are in danger, of course they're going to do whatever they can. So in the first instance, accept them, do not return them back home, figure out what their circumstances are, if they are classified, if they qualify as a refugee, then they require protection under international law. Right? But don't penalise them for illegal entry. Well, this is being broken all the time these days, this issue. And what's happening in the United States, for example, at the moment, is this idea of a third safe country of asylum. Do you all know what that is? What the third safe country of asylum is? So you've got people at the Mexican border wanting to come into the United States and claiming refugee status, right? So if they make it, the US really is obliged not to send them back, but to determine whether they are refugees or not. Now, there's this principle that people suggest. I don't think that it's in the law at all, but basically refugees or asylum seekers are not allowed to choose which country they want to go to. Right? I want to go to the United States. Well, you can't go to the United States. It's not your decision. So if you are a refugee from Venezuela and you make your way over a number of countries, if you go through Guatemala, now there's an agreement between the United States and Guatemala, right? So that if you go through Guatemala, you should stay there because it's a safe country and you can be safe there. So you are coming from Venezuela That's the first country. You want to go to the US, that's the second country. But you can get asylum and safety and protection in Guatemala. That's the third country. That's what it means. The third safe country of asylum. Right? And asylum seekers are required to seek refugee status, to seek asylum in the first safe country that they go to. That's not always the country that they want to stay in, right? They may not see it as safe, but others may. So you have all this debates about where people should go. In Australia, you know, I don't know if you know about the history of Australia. Has been breaching the principle of the 51 Convention for many years now. It's a pariah country with regard to refugees who come from Indonesia on the boats. Many have died, but they intervene and stop them from entering into the Australian territorial waters. So they get them in international waters and take them to these islands that Australia either owns or has made deals with to send the asylum seekers there, put them in detention centres there, and the stories of how they have languished there for years, the suicides, the deaths, the diseases and so on, are horrendous. This is my country. But they argued that these people should have sought asylum in Indonesia, and Indonesia, for many of these people coming, Iraqis, Syrians, Afghans, seeking asylum in Australia, can get to Indonesia very, very easily, right? And they don't need a visa because they're Muslims. So then they get on the boats, and then the problems start after that. So the convention says that people shouldn't be detained if they're asylum seekers. Yet we see detention centres of all kinds all around the world to put asylum seekers into, and separating children. And basically these detention centres they're prisons, but just under another name. In Australia, this is figures in Australia, 30,000 arrived by sea and were trapped by that asylum process and sent to these detention centres on these islands. It's pretty nasty. I'm going to have to move a little bit quicker than I. So I believe that the Refugee Convention itself, the 1951 Convention itself, is under tremendous challenge today because of these breaches by various countries that are Western countries in particular. And this distinction between refugees and economic migrants means the distinction between protection and non-protection, between the right to work and the right not to work, no right to work, and the right to work. Right? So if you're a refugee, you're granted protection, but you're not allowed to work. Right? Because you're being protected by the UNHCR. In 1951, when the convention was passed, that began this new era for refugees not having the right to work. Prior to that, under the League of Nations, refugees were actually chosen on the basis of their compatibility for the workforce in resettlement countries, like the United States. They would look for people, for example, they wanted farmers, so they asked for farmers to bring, and so on and so forth. So going back to this idea of the idea of delivering a person to their place of safety and to protect people, to accept people without consideration for the motivation for their request for asylum. Right. Here's where we get this distinction now. And we have let me put this all here. There are two views One is saying the so-called inclusivist view, which says that migrants are people who have moved from their usual place of residence, regardless of their legal status and their motivations for moving. Refugees are just a particular group of migrants. If you look at the numbers of migrants around the world, they're far, far greater than the number of refugees. Right? And the UN, what they call, I'm having to be careful here because I have a little antagonism towards the IOM. The IOM stands for the International Organization for Migration, which began at the turn of the century and has been trying until recently to become a part of the United Nations. It now is a part of the United Nations, an affiliate organization to the United Nations, but it's very aggressive, and it calls itself now the UN Migration Agency. And they basically want to have control over all issues to do with migration and refugees, because you see they're wanting to subsume refugees under the rubric of migration. Now they're being opposed vehemently by the UNHCR, which is the so-called residualist position, to say that there is a clear distinction. Migrants are people who have moved from their usual place of residence for any reason other than fleeing persecution. They are a diverse residual category of people who are not refugees. Migrants do not need or qualify for international protection. And this is the position of the UNHCR, a very strong, unwavering position that they're taking, to say migrants cannot be mistaken for refugees. We have international law, the 51 Convention, that says we must protect refugees, but we must determine that they are refugees first, and then we will provide them with the protection under international law. And migrants are not deserving of that. Why? Why do you think they make this distinction? What is the distinction between what they now call an economic migrant, somebody who's just seeking a better life somewhere else, and a refugee? What do you think would be the main difference?
I think a refugee is someone who has been accepted by governments to seek its services and support, whereas a migrant worker is one who wants to move to another country to be willing to work, but then the government usually doesn't accept them.
Yeah, but it's the reasons why they're not accepted, why one is accepted and why one is not. What do you think try to think about the UNHCR's position. They have to administer the convention.
Motivation behind, we move from
clearly their motivations are different. Right? One is fleeing persecution, the other is seeking better economic conditions for their lives and their families. So what's the difference? Okay, I'll tell you.
the need for safety, basically.
Yeah.
One can be sent back and the other.
Yes?
One can be sent back and not the other.
Exactly. One can go home. A refugee cannot go home. But an economic migrant, regardless of the economic circumstances and conditions of their lives back home, even if it's not a nice government, nonetheless, they can go home, right? And that's the key distinction, yes.
But I don't really think sometimes it's difficult to differentiate, like for instance in the case of Syria. Some people are persecuted because of their political affiliation with certain groups, but the country is uninhabitable. So I flee not because of persecution, but I cannot go back.
But that's
But
the circumstances, you are persecuted. I mean, if you stay there, the chances of being bombed or killed and so on, or not having enough water, etc., because of this conflict, is classified. I mean, the point is that Syrians, as I said before, are given prima facie refugee status. You don't have to prove, if you're a Syrian, you don't have to prove that you're a refugee, as with other countries, because it's so enormous what has happened to them. It's the largest single refugee crisis numbers in history, is the current Syrian situation. So here I posed the question, which is closer to the Islamic view? That the Islamic view, of course, is that we don't distinguish between the motivation, whether they're fleeing persecution or whether they're seeking a better life. So how do you reconcile that position with this dilemma of distinguishing between an economic migrant and a refugee, that these international organisations, and in accordance with current international law, refugee law, demands this distinction, and that's the tension that is currently being played out. Then there's human trafficking, and a lot of my work kind of borders around issues on human trafficking. I published some papers about trafficking. This is the definition of what's called the Palermo Protocol, which comes under the United Nations Office for, I can never remember it, Office for Organised Crime and Drugs, something like that. And so I've broken it up into three parts, this definition, because that's how it's actually administered. So the act, of recruitment, transportation, transfer, harbouring, or receipt of persons by means of threat, use of force, coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power. You can look all these definitions up readily on the internet, by the way. For the purpose of exploitation, which includes at a minimum exploiting the prostitution of others, other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labour or services, slavery or similar practices, and the removal of organs. So it's a big definition. It has proven to be a very unwieldy definition, that it's been very difficult to administer. Relatively few traffickers have been prosecuted, but the legislation basically has meant more actions and activities towards protecting the victims of trafficking. And principally, trafficking has been mostly referred to as something kind of extraordinary, and mainly to do with women and children and girls, in particular in relation to prostitution, forced prostitution. No country is immune from trafficking, as we are discovering every day. There was a documentary quite a few years ago on Nepal, the selling of young girls who end up in Delhi or Calcutta in the brothels. And it was a documentary. You can see it on the internet if you look it up. The Selling of Innocence. There has been a sequel to that, one or two sequels to that original one. But that film had such an impact on me that I continued my research in this area. But it was so awful to watch in that film a scene with a secret camera watching an illiterate farmer in a very remote area of Nepal selling his young daughter to somebody, not knowing where she was going or what was going to happen to her. But he had become in such dire circumstances, in debt and so on and so forth, he felt, they lied to him what was going to happen. They'll give her a good job and so on and so forth and take care of her. And this beautiful, innocent girl, you know that within hours, her life will be the rest of her life will be absolute misery. And then they show you where they send them. So it still goes on today and in many parts of the world. In Egypt, I don't know if you've ever heard of the Urfi marriages, where often rich men from the Gulf states would go to these small villages, 2 or 3 villages in Egypt, and arrange Urfi marriages, or weekend marriages as they sometimes call them, and pay money. And often the parents would take the money. Sometimes they would take them back home with them. If they got pregnant, then they would send them back home and destitute, right? So when I was at the university, American University in Cairo, I was the director of the Migration and Refugee Studies program, and so I was dealing with refugees all the time. And the US Department of State used to come to me regularly each year to talk about the circumstance in Egypt, because the Department of State publishes each year the TIP report, which is the Trafficking in Persons report, which is a report on all countries around the world, and they give them a 3-tier status in relation to their position on human trafficking. And I talked to them about the Urfi marriages, and they put that as a form of trafficking into the report. So to try to shame Egypt into doing something about that. I'm not sure if it changed anything, but anyway, it is classified as a form of human trafficking. And Florida, just the other day, here was the front page of USA Today on the 31st about trafficking ring of prostitution in Florida. That's happening now, right? So, and you see that mostly women, and pretty much all of the women involved were migrants from other countries. From China, mostly from China, also Cuba, Haiti, Guatemala, and elsewhere. So, here we see situations where the state is not really capable of stopping these activities, right? Tremendous exploitation and degradation and humiliation. And so I like Zaman's idea of Haq al-Jawar or Haq al-Jar, the idea of neighborliness, people taking action themselves rather than leaving it to the state. People who have a moral conscience, right, to take action at the local level. This will be forthcoming in an edited volume, which I'm editing along with Saeed Hassan, on Islamic ethics and migration issues, that will be published by Brill, hopefully at the end of the year. Now I'm going to give you a case study. Remember I was talking the other day about corruption and the problems of corruption. Do you want to take a break? I don't know how long I've been talking for.
50 minutes. 50 minutes.
50 minutes, that's all I've been talking for? Okay. Yes, sir.
I have a question. Thank you in the beginning for providing all of the definitions, but I did want to get your thoughts on the terms that I think reflects privilege and a difference in status. And I lived in Qatar for a couple of years too. This is when it kind of first occurred to me. There have been articles written about it. Is that why is it that people coming to seek employment in other countries, when they're from Western countries, that are termed expats? Whereas, if they're from
Yes.
more underprivileged societies, they're migrant workers.
I think you can answer that question, can't you? You don't need me to answer that question. Yeah, there's a real class difference. I'm not sure if we could go as far as a racial difference. Certainly a class difference, and because it's also based upon educational qualifications, because you get more professionals, for example, who are coming from Western countries. But not always. I mean, a lot of Indian professionals are there. Indians are there, for example, at all ranks of the workforce, from high professionals and managing directors of corporations and so on, down to the bricklayers and construction workers. Yeah. But you're quite right. There is the term expat, which specifically relates to professionals, or what I call the professional, managerial, technical class.
Do you think the media has adopted the first inclusive definition of migrants because they put everybody, they don't distinguish between
The media is all over the place. Depends on the journalist, the quality of the journalist, let me put it like that. And some are just, you see so much rubbish being printed. Oops, sorry, my dear. They make up stories. These kinds of stories about migrants and so on are really popular. Journalists, it's so easy to write them. They just copy stuff that's coming from all sorts of places. It's very easy to research and do, but it's usually very superficial. But they can get a story out and they can do it quickly. Right? It's a sexy topic.
Consumption.
Yeah. But really, for Qatar, the bane of the Qatari authorities has been The Guardian in England, and two journalists in particular who began, all these things were written prior to that, but somehow this one particular article in The Guardian in 2015, see what The Guardian does and what some of the other big newspapers do now in this moment with the internet is that they don't just publish their newspaper, both hard copy and online, but they use Twitter, they use all the social media to send out these stories. And so they get much bigger coverage, and therefore they have much bigger impact. And so they did with the stories about Qatar. And Qatar has been under attack since 2010, when they were awarded the World Cup for 2022. And so it really began there. Those articles that came out of The Guardian were in fact also funded by Humanity United. And that's another whole set of stories behind that. So yeah, the media, and I've done training sessions with journalists on migration issues, particularly journalists from South Asia. They've asked me from time to time to do some training sessions with them on what to do, what to look for, to write better stories, more informed stories. But we still don't see a lot. More is coming. Some good stuff is coming from India and from Nepal at the moment, actually. Okay.
I found it interesting when you were talking about, the conflict between the IOM and the UNHCR.
And the ILO, I should have added, and the International Labour Organization.
I guess for the first two, that they're both within the UN. So why isn't there more, coordination?
They're all in the UN. I mean, the IOM, it's parallel to the UN, but they are characterizing themselves as part of the UN, and also that they are mandated to deal with migration issues for the UN. Now, the ILO, that has been dealing with migrant labour, for example, from its inception, the last 100 years, they do not get on well. Why? There was a very, very powerful article written just after the IOM were given a UN status as an affiliate to the UN. And it argued that the main problem with the IOM is that it is not a human rights-based organisation. Its constitution is not a human rights-based constitution, as the others are, because they come out of the UN. The ILO is a UN organisation. So is the UNHCR, right? And they're human rights based. The IOM is not. And in fact, I can tell you, but you will not find the evidence that it was actually originally established by the CIA. And it operates in a very secretive manner. It publishes lots and lots of good stuff, but all employees of the IOM are sworn to secrecy, and it's very difficult to deal with them. And so this is an interesting issue, because the issue of human security comes into this. Migration movements and statistics and so on and so forth, and information are a security issue, increasingly so. Why? Because these are people crossing borders. And today, all governments want to know who are crossing into their borders. And so you're getting more and more of biodata of people entering and exiting countries. And the IOM is poised to collect this data on a global scale in one organisation. No, I don't want to offer this as a conspiracy, but I think it is. I don't know. It's very hard to say. But the IOM wants more and more. They have their key terminology is migration management. They have done amazing things with refugees. They facilitate resettlement of refugees for the UNHCR. So there is cooperation at many levels. But still, it's an organisation that has some issues, right? From the perspective of the ILO, at least, and from the UNHCR. Okay. Shall I go on? Okay, so this has been part of my research. This field now that I'm going to talk to you about is a field that I actually have a really strong passion for, and I've been very much an activist to try to bring about changes on this issue. So it's about the actual recruitment of migrant labour, specifically to the Gulf, but also to elsewhere, to Lebanon, to Malaysia, Vietnam, lots of, Korea, lots of different countries that this applies to. But my research has been specifically on the Gulf. And I call it the transnational culture of corruption. And I need to just I'm going to give you a structural overview of how it all kind of works. What is the structure of this process? So my argument here, which you won't see, or you can now see it. I mean, I think that my work has been influential, and I'm now seeing it in different fora around the place coming out. But labour demand actually begins with corporations tendering for a project, right? So you have, particularly let's say in the construction industry, company wants to construct the building, so it applies tenders to get the contract to build the building, right? And proper democratic and capitalist principles are that you should have more than one person, more than one company competing to do the project in order to get the best price, right? So you have companies tendering for projects, whatever it might be, and COD is country of destination. So in the bidding process for a project, the first evaluation of applications for the tender, for the contract for the tender, is what they call the technical evaluation. So all the technical details to show, a company has to show that they are technically competent to do the project, to build the tunnel, to build the railway or the stadium, right, or whatever it might be. Now, so assesses the compliance with technical specifications. The second phase of a tender process is the commercial evaluation, which is the cost. So you're competent to do it, okay, what's it going to cost? What's going to cost us for you to do this, to complete this project? So they negotiate the best price. Now there may be, there often is, but not always, a policy to take the lowest price being offered, right? And we'll see that that's actually problematic. So if you accept the lowest price tendered, then they squeeze the company that's offered the lowest price to make it even cheaper. So take off another 15%, you know, and then you can get the contract. They do this sort of stuff, right? Well, and then what happens is the company that gets the contract, the main contractor, then has subcontractors, right, that will, what they call the supply chain. You probably heard this term increasingly now. People who are going to do the work for them. They might have just constructed the design. They might have the architects and the engineers that construct the design of what they're going to do. But then they got to get others to help them with, you know, the plumbing and the welding and all sorts of things that might be required to be done. They use subcontractors. So then they will squeeze their subcontractors for how much they're going to charge them to do the work that they're going to do, the specialist work. Okay, so it gets pretty tight. So this tendering competition, in their bids to get that contract, it's come to pass that they can say to themselves, we are not going to pay for the recruitment costs of the workers that we want to bring in to do the work, right? Because the agencies, the recruitment agencies in the countries of origin, in Nepal, in India, in Sri Lanka, wherever it might be, the agencies there are also competing with each other to get the contract to supply the labour. And in their competition, they'll say to the contractor, you don't have to pay anything, we'll supply the labour for you free of charge. How can they do that? They charge the workers. The workers themselves are paying for the jobs that they're getting, right? And sometimes it's a lot of money, and I'm going to show you just how much money that is. So if the company doesn't have to pay for the recruitment costs, they can reduce their budget and compete better to get that contract. And that's what they do. It's exactly what they do. And it's called the worker pays model. Now what we're trying to do is to change that to make it the employer pays model. Right? Are you with me? Or is it getting a bit complicated? Yeah.
sometimes with big projects you hear how the project went over budget.
Yes, always.
So, yeah, exactly.
Always.
I'm wondering, is it because in order to get the contract, the company is just underbidding and really underestimating the cost just to first get the contract and then charging more? Or what is the cause of going over budget so often?
Yeah, well, exactly that. That's one of the reasons. But also they have what's called oh, I've forgotten the term. There's a term which basically says that you have to change the contract halfway through because you forgot about certain things. There are certain things that weren't catered for and so on, and so you have to do this. Or they begin to build a building, and something that, in reality it doesn't work from the specifications and the drawings. It's not working in practice, so they have to change it, and that's going to cost money. So they actually build in, even in the tenders, they have a certain percentage to cater for those circumstances, right, that may or may not happen, right? And there's all those sorts of things. I mean, it's a mature industry, so they know what the sorts of things that happen. But there are more complicated things also in the construction industry that we now are increasingly aware of, and that is that in the construction industry in particular, companies just don't pay. I mean, the President of the United States, who's in the construction industry, his and his company are notorious for not paying their contractors, right? Notorious. And for not paying wages. That's that industry, right? And it happens in Qatar, and it happens throughout the Gulf. And there is a theory that comes from the British organisation Engineers Against Poverty that in fact these are deliberate strategies in the construction industry not to pay. And some of them have contracts that will pay when we're paid. We'll pay our subcontractors when the Qatari authorities pay us, or whether it's QF or whoever it might be. When they pay us, we'll pay you. That now in England, they've just passed a law banning this kind of clause in contract, because what invariably happens is workers don't get paid, right? And they should be the first to be paid. But what happens is when the company's not paid, they go bankrupt. And when they go bankrupt, then they don't have to pay. This is this terrible cycle that's occurring, and nobody's really addressing it properly. Okay. So, yes.
Under the table kind of bribes to get the projects approved.
That's what we're coming to right now.
It happens a lot.
Yeah. So what happens with this worker pays model? It means that workers in the countries of origin are being selected not based on their merit, not based upon their qualifications and experience, but also, and possibly mainly, based upon their ability and willingness to pay what they're being charged to get the job. It allows for deception in wage levels, what's called substitute contracts. When a worker arrives at the country of destination, they're given another contract, but it's for less money, less conditions. They're given food allowances. They play around with food allowances, and I'll give you an example later on. We have instituted, I was one of the authors of the Qatar Foundation mandatory standards for migrant worker welfare that has become now the standards for the whole country. And we insisted that companies provide food, not to just give food allowances. We were, in part of my research, we were interviewing a company, the senior executives of the company. We were sitting around a table, and I said, so are you are you providing food for your workers? They said, oh, well, we are now. I said, what do you mean we are now? He said, well, we used to just give them a food allowance. Then we found 50 of our workers in hospital suffering from malnutrition. They weren't eating. They were taking the food allowance and sending it back home to their families. They were treating it as part of their salaries and not eating properly. So they were making sure they would eat properly. And this is a big issue. And in Qatar right now, they've just announced this morning that the permanent minimum wage is going to be announced before the end of the year. And I've been consulted a number of times by the committee considering this. And I think they are going to include food. Food is very, very important. So you have a minimum wage for those who are being provided with food, but another minimum wage for those who are not, but who should get a food allowance. Right? So there's going to be a number of different calculations as to what the minimum should be. I should move on. So, the kafala. Do I need to talk to you about the kafala? I mean, it'll take me half an hour probably, but the kafala system is a system that was established in the Gulf states and in Lebanon and Jordan, Syria, to handle foreigners in the country. In fact, some recent scholarship has located that the actual origins of the kafala system as applied to foreigners working in the country, it was actually in Bahrain, was actually instituted by the British imperial authorities there in order that they instituted a sponsorship system in order to take control of foreigners who were coming into Bahrain with the first of all with the fishing and the pearl industry, but also later on with the oil and so on. But that meshed very well with the Islamic principles of kafala, and so it became called the kafala system to Islamize that process of sponsorship of foreigners. And so the power was given to individual citizens of the state. These are now nation states, very late in the day, in the 1960s, 50s and 60s, so that citizens would basically become the sponsors of foreigners coming to work and produce and develop the economy, right, in various capacities, whether they were engineers or unskilled workers or low-skilled workers. So they had tremendous control over the people that they sponsored. They would determine whether they could enter the country, they could restrict their freedom within the country, they could determine whether they had days off or not, and this is still operating today, and also whether they could exit the country. And they could, if they didn't want them, they could register that they have absconded without permission, and they could therefore be picked up. They therefore become illegal residents, and they could be picked up by the police, detained, and deported. So there's a whole history to this, and we've got a paper coming out in the new edited book on this. Anyway, if you want to know more about that, we can talk about it. But the control has actually led, of the kafala system, has led to issues to do with debt bondage or labour indebtedness, which leads to forced labour, trafficking, and what many people in the West are calling modern-day slavery. How does this work? Well, if workers are paying for their recruitment or paying for the jobs that they're going to get, they often don't have enough money to pay it, and they will borrow money. They do also, they sell land, they sell their animals if they come from rural areas. Their families raise the money by going into debt and so on and so forth to get enough money to send them to Qatar or to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So they get into debt. What does that mean? It means that when they arrive in the country of destination to take up the job, they have to do the job. If they are given another contract that is for less money, they can't complain. If they're not being provided with the things that they were promised, they can't complain. When I first started interviewing workers about this, I would ask, so are you getting what you were promised? No. Well, did you tell that to the company? Yes, I did. Well, what did the company say? They said, well, if you don't like it, you can go home. Knowing that the person is in debt and cannot go home because they have to pay back that money that they borrowed. And they're borrowing money from these loan sharks at up to 80% interest. Right? So they get into trouble. So it means that they are forced to do the work in conditions that they may not really agree with. And that's forced labour, with the threat that they'll be deported or sent back. Okay? So that's what has happened with this system that begins with the company tendering and not wanting to pay and wanting workers to pay for their recruitment costs. Well, I've done the research on this, and there's also, here's where some real corruption comes in. So let's say I am an agent in Bangladesh, right? And I want the business to supply Bangladeshi workers to a company in the UAE. So I go to the company, I know that they want some workers, and I say, look, we can supply them with you, they'll take a cut in salary. You won't have to pay any of the costs of recruitment, the airfare, nothing. We'll pay for all of that. Plus, he'll say, or I'll say to the human resource manager of the company, plus I'll give you something on the side. A gift, right? This is what we call kickback payments or kickback bribery. What I call bribery or exaction. It's not extortion because there's no real threat, which is what is normally attached to the concept of extortion, but it's called exaction. That is just pressuring to get money. So it depends who asks. So if I'm the human resource manager and I ask for the gift, that's exaction. But if the agent comes to me and says, I'll give you some money, that's bribery, right? So it's the same thing, but depends on what you call it something different depending on who asks for the money. I won't talk about that right now. So here, I've done the calculations. Can I get up? I just carry this with me. Just to show you what the actual costs are. Done the calculations, right? These are not fixed costs because you have variable costs. Sometimes they differ. For example, the airfare will differ depending on the time of the year or the season or the country. It might be further or closer to the country of destination. So the prices can differ of the airfare, right? And internal travel and food. I mean, workers are often recruited from remote areas. So the main office of the recruitment agent isn't usually in the main city. So it might be in Kathmandu. They come from from the mountains somewhere. So it costs money to get them to the city, to interview them, to test if they have the skills for the job and things like this. It costs money. Who pays for that? Well, the workers. And sometimes there's a sub-agent in the village. It might be a village elder, it could be a doctor or somebody. There is an Arabic term which is just escaping.
Simsa?
Yes, it's something. Thank you. Who will tell the person, yes, this is a good job, you know, you'll get this. And often there's considerable deception that occurs at the local level with what we call sub-agents. And they will take money as well from the workers. So these are the costs, right? So these are the costs in the country of origin. These are the costs in the country of destination, but I've now called them, this is an old table. I've changed it since I drew this up. So these costs here, I'm calling these not recruitment costs, but rather employment costs. Why? Because the costs here are borne after the worker arrives to the country of destination. Okay, so they're already employed. So the cost of getting a residency ID card and a medical examination and so on and so forth in the country of destination, they're already employed. They already have a contract. They're already being paid their salary. So these are employment costs, not recruitment. They've already been recruited. Okay? So if you add all this up, it comes to 1839, right? But the combined total here is 1367. So this is an approximation. Now, in Bangladesh, the charge to Bangladeshi workers is on average $3,300. That's a lot of money for Bangladeshis. It's a poor country, right? Now, if you take that 1839 there, right, and you deduct the costs of the country of destination, the employment costs, right, those are on the right-hand side, then it comes to 1,227. Because the employer is obliged really often to pay that, because they're already in the country. So the difference will be 2,073 from the 3,300, right? And if the employer pays the airfare, because sometimes and often they do, we'll reduce, we'll add that to the difference, which becomes to 2,473. Now, 2,473 is the surplus. The actual costs have already been paid for, and there's still this money left over. Where does that go? Right? Workers have no idea. They're just told how much to pay. They're not told what it's for or where it goes. They're not even given a receipt. Can you imagine handing over $3,300 and not getting a receipt? That's what happens every day. So how is it dispersed? What does the employer pay for? What should the employer pay for? What should the employee pay for? These are the questions, right, that I have answers to, but that's not the point right here. So, in fact, on average, $1,000 goes to the personnel in the employing company. When I was doing my research in Qatar, I went to 5 different countries of destination, and I spoke and interviewed all sorts of people, agencies and so on. And the agencies all thought that I came from the Qatar Foundation, and therefore I was looking, the research I was doing to see which company we wanted to choose to supply the Qatar Foundation with labour. And they wouldn't believe me when I told them I wasn't doing that. So there was one particular guy who was in Qatar who was representing one of these agencies in one of the origin countries. And he was literally harassing me, so I wasn't answering his calls. until I finally got fed up and I said, I answered the call. And I said, so what's in it for me? Oh. So he said, well, we can't talk about this on the telephones. Let's meet for coffee. So I said, okay. I was living in Education City Housing at the time. So let's meet at the supermarket. There's a cafe on the first floor. So we went there, and I took my phone and I turned on the recorder. Now, I confess that was not an ethical thing to do because I didn't tell him that I was recording. But for my own, I will never be able to use it, but it gave me the confidence to say that this happened. And so I said, if I give you a contract for 30 workers, what will you give me? He said, we'll give you $400. I said, what if I give you a contract for 100 workers? He said, well, no, we could make it $600. That's per worker, right? Per worker. So for a contract to supply 100 workers, he would give me $60,000 in cash under the table. No paperwork. Right? Why? Because the workers are paying for it. That extra money that the workers are paying goes to feed and to ensure that he gets this contract. That's what goes on. So if you have 1,000 workers and you're getting $1,000 per worker, it's $1 million. If you have 1 million workers, that's $1 billion just in the fraudulent kickback bribery payments. If it's 10 million workers, it's $10 billion, right? What it also means is that money is money that leaves the country of destination, countries of origin. For Bangladesh, where you have an average of about 500,000 leaving Bangladesh every year to find jobs, that's $500 million, $500 million is leaving Bangladesh, and they're not factoring that into their financial calculations at the national level. They will calculate the remittances that workers send back home, which is crucial for all of the economies of the countries of origin, right? But they're not factoring in these kickback bribes that are leaving the country. So there's approximately 20 million low-skilled migrant workers in the GCC. I mean, potentially that's $20 billion just in kickback bribes for the business. There are other levels of bribery that go on, and I'm sure you know about too. But this is what I'm concerned about, because it is money that's coming from the poorest, most vulnerable workers from these countries. Now, in my research, sometimes when one is doing field research, you sometimes get lucky. And I was lucky to get some documentation that actually proving these kickback bribes. Here is a ledger from an agency, right, showing the account of a human resource manager in a company that was bringing in large numbers of workers. And so you see here the description, labour, and amounts of money. And you'll see at the top there, cash paid, 15,000 in dirhams, so this is UAE, right? And then various labour, scaffolder, helper, and then cash paid, labour, scaffolder, helper. Then you see here, paid to Sri Lanka, telegraphic transfer, 50,000 And so you see all of these payments. All of these are the payments that are going to the human resource manager in the company. And that money is being taken by the agency from the workers to pay these kickback payments. So I got these documents for 2 years and part of another year, but so I've only used the 2 years. And this is the calculations. So we have for 2015 and 2016. And you'll see that this human resource manager received $575,901 in 15 in these payments. And then 400, so for the 2 years, over $1 million. So average of $500,000 or more per year, in addition to his salary. And nobody knows about this. Well, we don't know who knows about it. Maybe he's receiving this money and he's distributing it amongst others. We don't know. Okay. So what's interesting about this is that this is what is feeding the recruitment. So in the Gulf states, in construction sites, you have far more workers than are actually needed. Up to 10 times the number of workers on construction sites that are not needed, that are more than in other countries. Why? Because there is an incentive for the human resource manager and whoever else he's complicit with to bring in as many workers as possible, because they're getting money for every worker that comes in. And for every worker that leaves the company and has to be replaced, they're getting more money. So there's an incentive to have a high labour turnover within the company. Right? So, what's interesting is that everybody knows that this is occurring, but nothing's being done about it. Why? Because, as we talked about, there's not a level playing field. If a company decides that they're not going to do this anymore, it's going to cost them money, because it's money that they're not used to paying for these recruitment fees and charges, costs. And if they have to start paying, they won't be able to compete with those companies who are not paying, who are involved in this corruption. And that's the dilemma. And the disruption to the workforce, the disruption to the economic activity that might result in. And governments don't want that disruption. And particularly if you're building stadiums for the World Cup and you have deadlines, you don't want any disruption, right? So this is a problem. There are people who are working on this to change it, but it's a very, very slow process. Just to show you, this is a copy of one of the telegraphic transfers of 50,000 dirhams from UAE, from Dubai to Sri Lanka. So it tells you that the human resource manager is a Sri Lankan who's receiving this money. That's a lot of money in Sri Lanka. He probably has a nice house there. Here's another way in which companies exploit or defraud workers. You see, this is a contract, a labour contract, for a woman cleaner in a cleaning company. You can see on the left-hand side, Qatar Riyals 1,100 plus 300, that's food allowance, FA meaning a food allowance, right? So here is her payslip, and what do you see? on the payslip, you see that the basic salary, yes, it's $1,100 reals, but the food allowance that she's given is actually only $200, when the contract says $300. Right? Not only that, the confidence of this employer also says deductions $100 for recruitment charges. Now, in Qatar, this is illegal. The labour law in Qatar forbids any charges to workers for recruitment. It's enshrined in the labour law. And so they're taking money out of the salary of the worker for $100 per month, right? Illegally.
For how long?
Indefinitely. Yeah. So you do a simple calculation. Food allowance 100, recruitment fee 100, 200 reals per month. Over 3 years of a contract, that's $2,000, right? And you multiply that by 500 workers, they're saving $1 million. And 500 is not a lot. I mean, the companies, they have multiple thousands of workers. And if they're just not paying 100 reals, they're saving a lot of money. Right? Who's checking this? Nobody. These little details are not being checked on a daily basis, so companies can get away with it. These are unscrupulous employers, right, who are exploiting. Not all companies do that, but a lot do, more than should. So, and also workers not being paid at all. There are cases, you've probably seen them in the press, where workers haven't been paid for months. There are cases where a worker might not have been paid for 2 years, working for nothing, and then the company goes bankrupt and they never get paid. They have, worked hard for years or months, whatever it might be, and not being paid. Now, this is absolutely fundamental to Islam, is it not? One of the most beautiful quotes in Islam is this: give to the worker his wages before his sweat dries. I like to say the sweat on his forehead rather than under his arm, because, So, what does this mean? It means pay the employee in a timely manner. Pay them on time. And the Gulf state, all but one of the Gulf states have introduced a wage protection system. And that wage protection system, I did a study of the wage protection systems in the Gulf states, and my findings were that they were not wage protection systems at all. They're simply wage notification systems. Yes, but they were designed specifically to be able to see if an employer is paying the workers on time in accordance with this dictum. Right? But there is no guarantee that the actual wage was the correct wage, just whether they're being paid on time. Forcing employers to pay the wages into a bank account instead of by cash, so that there's a formal official record of the payment. Okay? And then recently I did a study of the wage protection system in Qatar for the Ministry of Labour in conjunction with the International Labour Organization to look more detailed into the wage protection system. And so I found all sorts of problems to try to get them to be clear on making sure that the wage is correct, including overtime and things like this, all sorts of problems with the system. I've given them my recommendations, and they loved it, and they're going to make the changes, at least some of them. But I don't know when. I'm waiting to see. So, my issue, of course, was these other issues about not just paying on time, but paying the proper wage. How do you determine this? Right. One who hires a worker but does not pay him his right wages owed to him after fulfilling his work. There it's clear. It's the correct wage, not just on time. O my people, give just measure and weight, nor withhold from the people the things that are their due. That's also in relation to trading and bargaining and so on and so forth. Right? And of course, this is so beautiful. A person who has a brother under his authority should feed him out of that which he eats himself, and should dress him with the same kind of clothes which he wears himself. He should not assign work to him which is beyond his capacity, and I'm so grateful to Mohamed Ghaly for that in relation to my employment. And if you do so, then help him in his work. Now, this is a principle. Do you see this in practice? No. Certainly not in relation to the migrant workforces in the Gulf states. Do you want to take a break? I've got, yeah. And then I'll show you another case study where I've got some nice photographs for you. And then we'll talk about xenophobia and 10-minute break. You got longer than that? Yeah. Okay, I think I'll start just to say that the paper that I've written with Saeed Hassan, which is about the kafala, is an argument showing that the kafala isn't all as bad as it has been made out to be, that its origins have great merit in terms of the sort of trust and care of a kafil towards the makful, the recipient or the person who is being sponsored, and the history of the kafala as it's applied in many different contexts, including with orphans and so on. But there have been international organisations, particularly the International Trade Union Confederation head, who has likened the kafala to slavery. So she was just arguing that kafala means slavery, or modern day slavery. And it's not quite like that, but it has been used in that way, not as perhaps originally intended. So I did, what I'm going to show you in this case study of migrant domestic workers. Now, domestic workers, female domestic workers, have been given far more attention than any others, other migrant workers. This is work that I did back in, when I was in the American University of Beirut, so back in around 2003, 2004. And why I put this quote, which comes from yesterday, is it the 30th of July? Day before yesterday, from the new Minister of Labour in Lebanon, who says the sponsorship system for domestic worker needs to be amended. What we are doing is breaking the link between workers and employers. Workers sign contracts in a language they do not understand and are entitled to a weekly opportunity and must enjoy freedom. We will discuss with public security proposals to do what is needed on the subject of domestic workers. Now this comes, 2004, 2019, we're talking about 15 years since I produced what I'm going to show you now. And the data, I'm only going to give you a snippet of it, but the data that I found in my study was actually used to establish a ministerial committee to look into the reform or producing a new law in Lebanon for domestic workers, or to bring them into the labour law. And yet, 15 years later, nothing has happened. And we get a Minister of Labour saying this, right? No, we need to kind of look into this and do something about it. So it just shows you that, in fact, with migrant domestic workers, is in a way far more difficult to bring about reform than others. The reforms in Qatar on the kafala system, the new law of sponsorship, which was in 2017, now has completely secularized the language in that new law. No longer, either in Arabic or in English, is the word kafala or kafil or makful. That's been eliminated and secularized. So it's strange what's actually happening now. And this is through the pressure from international organizations to change. In Qatar now, the ILO head, Hutan, has just made a statement either yesterday or today saying that by the end of the year, not only will there be a permanent minimum wage, but also the elimination of the NOC. Do you know what an NOC is? A no objection certificate. What an NOC is what the kafil provides to the worker if they want to change jobs, or in the past if they wanted to leave the country, and so on. Now, if they eliminate the need for an NOC, that means the workers can change employers before their contract has expired, that will usher in a completely new system. It will be really a complete structural reform, and it will mean a local labour market that will develop in the country. At the moment, the kafala system prevents a local labour market. The labour market now for workers is an international labour market. They go to countries abroad to find workers. Whereas if they're here in the country, they can move around and employers can compete against one another, providing higher salary, better wages, better conditions, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's another story. Here, we're talking about domestic workers, which is a really unique occupation, primarily for women, in the households of their employers. So they live in the private sphere. For them, their public sphere, that is where they work, is the private sphere in the household. And in the Middle East, they are very, very restricted. Many of them are not allowed out of the house at all. They don't have a day off, and so on and so forth. So these are the problems. Now, I actually was the first to actually do a survey of domestic workers, of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon at that time. It was very, very difficult. It took a long, long time. But I did it. And at that time, so March 2006, at that time, it was mainly Sri Lankans who were the domestic workers there. They were the largest. That all changed after, August 2006, with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And there were evacuations. A lot of the women left, and their governments prevented them from coming back to Lebanon because it was too dangerous. And so they brought more Ethiopians in. And so now the largest number are Ethiopians and others. And Nepalis are another different mixture of nationalities doing the domestic work in the Lebanese households. So around 150,000 was the estimation at that time. And the sample that I did, so interviewed over 600 domestic workers in mainly Beirut, and in their own languages, and sometimes in very difficult and interesting circumstances. I won't go through all the methodology for you, but just to give you, I'm not going to show you all of the results, just some selected results. Of the hours of work, for example, 65% were working 11 or more hours per day, 42% working 13 or more hours per day, and 31% working 15 or more hours per day. Some workers saying they were on call 24 hours a day. So, they could be woken up in the middle of the night if a child wanted a glass of milk or something like that. So far more hours being compelled to work than the legal limits. But one thing I haven't kind of mentioned is that in the Gulf states, in Egypt, in Lebanon, no longer in Jordan, I don't think, but domestic workers were excluded from the labour law, specifically excluded from the protection of the labour law, as well as others, like some in Qatar, for example, workers who are working in the petroleum industry are excluded from the labour law. There's another set of regulations for them because it's a crucial industry, right? So why do you think that domestic workers were excluded from the protection of the labour law? Why would they be excluded?
It allows for more exploitation. It allows for more exploitation.
No, well, the law wouldn't want to say that, would they?
Maybe they didn't see it as
They work in private families.
They work in private families, but so?
More control over them.
Yes. It's not seen as a proper employee-employer relationship. They argued that it was a personal relationship. It's not real work, right? And in the in Egypt, they actually have a real explanation for it in the legislation. And they say because it's a personal relationship, not a work relationship. Plus, you cannot allow the worker to just change employers whenever they like, because the migrant domestic worker, when she comes in, she has a contract. When that contract's finished, she has to leave the country. And why is that? Because she is privy to the secrets of the family. And you don't want her to go and work for your neighbour and for her to tell everything about what you do in the privacy of your home. It's a security issue. So that's another reason for the restrictions. Okay. Now things are beginning to change. A lot of international pressure, particularly from the International Labour Organization, to provide legal protection for domestic workers, as employees. There's a new law in Qatar, for example, just for domestic workers. Do you have regular time off? 34% said no. No time off. Okay. Others once a week. In Lebanon, it's usually a Sunday that they have off. And you can see domestic workers in the streets, and they go to the churches and so on, and sometimes they go on demonstrations now. So there have been some changes, but did you make any payments to the Lebanese agency after your arrival? 37% said yes, and then it's taken from their salary. This is the difference. They may not pay money up front. For example, in the Philippines, domestic workers being recruited do not pay anything. I mean, there's legislation in the Philippines against it. But that doesn't stop the employer from taking out from their salary and giving it to the agency or keeping it for themselves, which is what happens. So my estimation is about $4 million are taken from domestic workers in Lebanon each year by the employers, by their employers. Now, about abuse, have your employers yelled at you? Well, there's a bit of a debate about this. They say, Arabs, they yell anyway, so you just have to get used to it. They're told before they leave their countries that, Arabs yell a lot. Don't get offended, Right? Who mainly yells at you? Their female employer, the madame of the household, is the main yeller. Yeller. I don't know if that's the right word. But children also get involved in abuse, which is not often adequately recognised, that children can be very abusive towards domestic workers in the household. Name calling. When I see at the top I've got Cairo, I also did a study in Cairo, interviewed over 800 domestic workers in Cairo. So hamara is the most common term that they're called, meaning donkey or stupid. Hayawani. I don't think I should repeat these. Right? So you can see them up there, the sorts of abusive terms. And of course, in Cairo, with the refugees, a lot of the refugees, both male and female, do domestic work in the households. It's actually, for them, it's pretty much one of the very few jobs that they can actually get. Even though they're not allowed to work, they will do this work and it's tolerated. Right? So they're called abad, right? You know what abad means. So, etc. Not nice. And honga bonga, well, And again, the female employer, have you ever been physically hit? So 14% said yes. Right. And who hits you? The female employer is the main. So 61% versus 23, 5 and 11. Right? So you see, by far the largest proportion of abuse is from the female employer, the female head of the household. And have you been sexually harassed? Of course, that's not the female head of household, but usually the male. Right? So 7% said that they were sexually harassed in one form or another, which included rape. I mean, rape, of course, is always underreported because of the shame attached to it. So what we do is when we're interviewing, we don't just ask, have you been raped? I mean, but we'll ask, do you know of other women who have been raped or sexually abused or sexually harassed? And then you get a much higher percentage saying yes. And that's one way of, yes?
How were you able to get access to these interviewees given the restrictions?
Well, I stood outside. I was the first person to gain access into the Ethiopian church there, which is one of the most incredible experiences I've ever had. It took me months meeting the priest to finally get approval to go there. And then I was able to do interviews with the women leaving the church, so in the street, and I had Ethiopian women doing the interviews for me, but I supervised them. I went to a number of churches. So a lot of them, even if they weren't Christian, they would go to a church on a Sunday. In Hamra, there was one for the Filipinos. Filipinos used to go there. There was one down by the Corniche for Sri Lankans. There were a safe house for Sri Lankans and safe houses by Caritas, which is do you know about Caritas? It's a Catholic, international Catholic organisation, welfare organisation that have done a lot. Were given a huge grant by their head office to do welfare work for domestic workers in Lebanon. They have full-time lawyers to help represent them and so on, and a safe house. So I was able to gain access there, and also I went and saw the head of General Security. The General Security is the force that is responsible for all foreigners in the country. So the head of that organisation, his name was Jamil Sayed at that time. He was the head of General Security. He saw me and even showed me the new detention centre, which was where his office was. He had a secret exit from his office to the detention centre, which was underneath a bridge that was a car park originally. They made it into a detention centre. So I was able to even get access to some of the women in the detention centre and in the street. And then also, one of the features of domestic workers in Lebanon was this, what they call the phenomenon of balcony talk. Women who are stuck in the house, in the apartments, not allowed out, they could go onto the balcony and talk to other domestic workers on the balconies of other buildings around them or other apartments. And in fact, we were doing interviews across, right? So somebody knew that there was somebody there, they made arrangements, and they actually asked them the questions across the balconies when their employers were out of the house, right? Not when they were there. They wouldn't do it. Right? So it was a pretty amazing study done. It's very difficult because, you see, methodologically it's very problematic. You ask somebody, oh, can we come in and interview your domestic worker? So if they say yes, you know that it's going to be fine, that they've been treated properly, etc. But if they say no, what are you going to do? So it was very difficult. So we just had to make the best of those we could get access to.
Are they usually allowed to have smartphones
At that time, now yes, I think most of them actually have phones. But at that time, if they had a phone, it was taken away from them. Often when the worker arrived, the employer would go through all of their bags and everything. Sometimes they would take them immediately into the bathroom, shave them, clean them, de-lice them, all sorts of things because they thought they were dirty, etc. Sometimes they would cut their, and for the Sri Lankans to have their hair cut was an absolute trauma because the women and their hair was sacred, right? Particularly for the Sinhalese, and so on. Yeah, some very difficult circumstances for them.
They take their passports away too.
And they took their, yeah, you'll see, I think that we certainly asked them that. The types of sexual harassment. Who holds your passport? So, 85%. No, more than that. 99% had their passports held by somebody. Sorry, the formatting went out somewhere. But pretty much, unless they were freelance. When I say freelance, well, these are women who were not living in the household. They had run away from their employer, but were staying in the country illegally and freelancing, working for a number of different people at the same time, but doing it illegally. but they would keep a copy of their passport so that if they're in the street and General Security picked them up, they could show them. Okay, so not allowed. If they got pregnant, they were immediately deported.
Some were deported.
Yep.
Would they be able to get abortions?
Yes, it would. They were often arranged by the employer, and paternity might have been the employer, etc. We don't know. We don't. That's typically we don't get those sorts of details. But a study was done on domestic workers in psychiatric wards of a particular hospital, and quite often, if they were not compliant, they would take them to the psychiatric ward. They would get shock treatment over 3 days, involuntary, and then deported. Shocking. So, yeah, this is a photograph of women in Bangladesh being trained as domestic workers in Dhaka. Behind somewhere, not in the photograph, there's a kind of a kitchen where they do all the training and how to make beds and clean and cook and so on and so forth. This is in Manila in the Philippines, so it's another training program for domestic workers. It's a man who's teaching them how to set a table. But look at the crowded room. This is in the agency offices.
The ones that wearing the hijab are the employees only, or
They vary. They may be Muslims and they may not. From the Philippines. They're not all Muslims from the Philippines, but some are. Bangladesh, yes. They're all Muslims. This is just a poster by Western Union. Western Union was everywhere in the countries of origin, right? Send your money back home through us. They make a lot of money from the remittances as an intermediary. This is a Beirut airport. This is domestic workers arriving at the airport. They are put in line like military style, and they're taken separately through the passport control, and they're taken then to the General Security Office, right, where they're checked and registered and so on. And then the employer, the kafil, comes to the airport to pick them up. So I took this photo, and then the General Security saw me taking a photo and told me to stop. That's him. So I took a photo of him telling me not to take a photo. And then I was a very naughty boy, and I took another photo after that. And you see in the distance, you see a man with a trolley with the luggage. That's the employer who has just come and picked up his domestic worker who is behind him. Looks like probably an Ethiopian. And he will take her passport. The General Security will give her passport to him or to her, as the case may be, and they'll keep the passport and then take her to the house. So imagine arriving in Beirut and experiencing this, and then going somewhere to the place where you're going to work. These workers do not know where they are in the world. They have not a clue where they are. Right? Or often, and at that time, they didn't know where to go if there was any trouble. Now they're being told, they're being given pamphlets before they leave, phone numbers to call in cases of abuse and emergencies and so on and so forth. So things have improved a bit in that respect. Just to talk about family dependency, I used to go to a place called Badara, where a lot of domestic workers would go on their day off and do some shopping. There were restaurants like Ethiopian restaurants, Philippine restaurants, hairdressers and things like this that they would go to. So here was a guy coming along with his either grandchild or child, I think grandchild, and the two domestic workers, right? So they arrived, and I took their photo as they arrived, and then they are talking, and then the two domestic workers go off to do some shopping, and the child starts crying uncontrollably because they're leaving. And he's not comfortable staying with his grandfather, right? Now that attachment and the whole dynamics of children in the household that these domestic workers bring up, right? Even if they have their own children back home that they're not with, they're bringing up the children in the household that they're working in a foreign country. And in Jordan, the UNIFEM, as it was then, the United Nations Women's Organization, commissioned a cartoonist in Jordan to draw some caricatures about these relationships in relation to domestic workers. And they gave them to me. So in relation to this, oops, where are we? Oh gosh. How do I get back?
Just an escape. Press escape.
Oh.
And then go down.
Yeah, so in relation to that, here's the caricature. So the long lost son returns. The mother says, "Son, you're back." And he goes to the Sri Lankan domestic worker saying, "Mummy, mummy." Right? Because for all intents and purposes, and I've heard people say, I've heard adults tell me, yes, she was more like my mother than my mother. I never knew my mother, even though she was there. Right? And this is a famous photograph during it was just after the assassination of the former Prime Minister Hariri, and all of the demonstrations to get Syrians out of the country after that. And so this woman comes along to a demonstration with her domestic worker, making her hold up a flag and chant the slogans, you know, "Madame wants Syria out," was the caption, which was very funny but very telling. And here's another one where he has this situation. I will only, she says, she's all battered, she's got bruising and everything all over her face. "I will only tolerate your beating and insults in one case only. Get me an Asian maid to take it all out on her, then you can beat me as much as you like." So he beats her, she beats the maid. That's the assumption here. I don't like it. I don't think this is really what happens. But it's an assumption that many people make. When I did the survey, I asked the domestic workers what was the relationship between the husband and wife of your family, and we did not find a relationship between abuse and an abusive relationship there. But anyway, it's something that people use as an excuse to blame men for the abuse of the domestic workers by the women. I don't know if that will get a bite, but anyway. So here's the idea of the maid as a domestic appliance. And it's interesting because I've seen a booklet that the Philippines government produced for employers of Filipina domestic workers. And it reads just like an instruction booklet if you get a new refrigerator or a new washing machine or something like that. Treat her well, she'll work hard and, and long and so on. Deaths, Human Rights Watch did I just published a paper actually on some deaths of Filipino workers when I was there. they were saying on average one a week. That might be a slight exaggeration, but these are really problematic, and very few proper investigations are done on these deaths. And I believe, and I've always believed, that there were more murders than accidents or suicides, but it's very difficult to prove. Well, so that speaks for itself. And so here's another one of those cartoons, right, about awareness campaigns, saying, do we need any awareness campaigns for servants' rights? What an exaggeration. Sure, we hit them sometimes. They don't have days off. They work day and night, and we treat them like slaves at times. But what happens under my roof is my business and no one else's. Right? And this is the dilemma. The access to the private sphere, to the household, is very difficult. Police can't just walk in. You need a judge to make a decision to allow them to come in, and it's very difficult. In fact, an awareness campaign was done by Human Rights Watch, and they produced these posters. These posters were of Lebanese women wearing a maid's uniform and were placed all over the place, right? Have you ever been punished for breaking a plate? Have you ever been called a donkey at work? Have you ever worked for years without a day off? Have you ever been denied food when you are hungry? Now, what's interesting about that campaign was that it was totally unsuccessful. Can anybody tell me why? It might have been us.
Immigrants don't have access to this.
No, but it was for their employers to treat the maids better. It was directed towards employers. But it was totally unsuccessful because, in fact, it antagonized the Lebanese women who were the employers of domestic workers. Why? Because they felt insulted that they would be likened to a domestic worker, that they would be placed, that they should place themselves in that position in order to empathize. No, that was unacceptable. Interesting, yeah? Okay. I think we should take a little break. I need a little break. And then we can talk about this.